I'm Margaret Johnson, and on behalf of the Program for Instructional Effectiveness, I'm delighted to welcome you today to listen to Matt Levay talk about his great ideas about teaching. Matt Levay is an associate professor and director of graduate studies in English, and he teaches courses in 20th century British and American literature, modernism and the avant-garde, popular culture, including comics and film studies. He is the author of the book Violent Minds, Modernism and the Criminal, published by Cambridge University Press, and he currently serves as the book review editor for the Journal of Modern Periodical Studies. Matt is also a regular instructor for the Harvard Summer School, and before coming to ISU, he was a 6-time recipient of the Harvard University Certificate of Teaching Excellence. He was named an ISU Outstanding Teacher in 2021, and COVID permitting, he'll be the Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Warsaw's American Studies Center in spring 2022. Today, Matt will be talking to us about writing in sequence, how to prompt better thinking in any course. Matt, it's all yours.
Thanks, Margaret. And thanks, obviously, to everybody for coming. I know, it's a Friday, but I also know it's a Friday a few weeks into another, I think, challenging semester for everybody in a sequence, speaking of sequences, in a sequence of challenging semesters. So I'm really grateful to see so many people. And I'm glad to, of course, be invited to talk with you. I was joking before we recorded, so maybe I shouldn't say any of this and just leave it. But, I was thinking when I got invited to do this and as I started writing my talk, there's really nothing so terrifying to me as talking about teaching in front of a room full of really excellent teachers, and some of that is not because of unfriendliness or perceived unfriendliness. It's because I think I'm regularly so inspired by the variety of teaching that I see here at ISU, and some of you I've seen teach or know well as teachers. And so, presenting my ideas is always a little challenging, especially when we call this event Great Ideas in Teaching, which is sort of a lot to live up to. When I started to write a talk about great ideas in teaching, I immediately sort of started to question the greatness of any idea that I really had. And especially because I think, like a lot of people, so much of my pedagogy is really a response to challenges that I have in the classroom. I mean, I think we all have conceptions of what our teaching philosophy is or what we want our teaching to do, and then it's confronted with the challenges that are posed to that philosophy in the classroom itself. And so a lot of my ideas about teaching really do stem from these kinds of issues that arise in the classroom and trying to work through them in some sort of thoughtful or logical way. What that means sometimes, I think, for all of us, and of course me included, is that pedagogy can be localized, right? Like a lot of times when we are developing our teaching ideas, our teaching philosophy, it's very unique or very specific to our particular classroom. And so thinking about pedagogy in a way that might be more expansive to connect to people in a variety of disciplines is itself a challenge too. I don't know that any of my ideas about teaching are necessarily great, but I think they've worked for me and continue to work for me, and I continue to work at them. I don't think my methods are necessarily better than anybody else's. And I don't think they're uniformly applicable to all given scenarios. The problems that I'm going to talk about today are really specific to some upper level courses I've taught, and yet I can see ways in which the ideas that I've used to address those challenges I use in lower level courses and introductory level courses too. So I want to acknowledge that at the outset, that a lot of what I'm going to talk about has to do with upper level courses, but I think it does translate to other venues. They're also not uniformly applicable to all disciplines, although again, I think transferability is important, and I'll talk about this a little later, how some of these ideas can transfer across disciplinary boundaries. So I do think these ideas can be useful. I do think they can be tailored to other contexts. So as a result, I'm going to sort of wobble a little bit in my my remarks between the specific and the general, right? Between things that I think are specific to my own classroom and my own practice, and things that I think are generally applicable to a wider variety of settings. And so that's something I look forward to talking about as well. So, coming up with this, I naturally overpromised in my title, just as I was really daunted by the title of this series. I of course gave myself an impossible title, not just the point about better thinking, right? So the title of my talk, Writing in Sequence, I think will become pretty clear. The point, how to prompt better thinking in any course. I'm going to try and be more concrete about what I mean by better thinking, because I don't just mean that in a general sense, but also any course, right? So we'll talk a little bit about where I think these methods work well in specific courses and where they might in others. So I'm gonna, every time I've been teaching in Zoom for what feels like an eternity, as we all have, and yet every time I try and share my screen, I say something like, bear with me, like this is the most challenging thing I've ever done. So I am going to say, bear with me. I'm going to try and share share my screen. I have a few slides that I'd like to go through. And let's see. Okay, is everybody able to see this? All right. Okay, good. So I thought it might be interesting as a way of beginning to kind of walk you through my thought process when I try and come up with an idea for teaching, and specifically an idea that responds to specific challenges. So I thought, rather than kind of start out with, here's what I do, I'd like to talk about how these ideas kind of originate in response to real classroom challenges and classroom practice, and sort of think backward. So this is going to be kind of a talk where I say a little bit or demonstrate a little bit about how I develop responses to particular problems. So in this case, the idea for my presentation today comes from two specific phenomenon that I have been seeing or was seeing in some of my classes, particularly at the 3000 level and above, but it's not unique to those settings. So first of all, and I think these are two related challenges, and I'll say why in a second. So first of all is what I'm calling the problem of the disjointed semester. And what I mean by that is a course where at the end of the semester, students seem to struggle to recall information presented at the start of that semester, right? Where we get to the end and it seems like the assignments they've done, the work they've done is meant to be cumulative, and yet students are sort of forgetting some key concepts or having trouble recalling key concepts. And I'm going to emphasize key concepts here because if a student, forgets, a date or something like that, if they forget, some small incidental detail, that's perfectly understandable. But core concepts are what I'm really after here. And I think part of the disjointed semester comes from assignments that I think could be described as one and done, right? That is, not cumulative assignments, but a series of assignments that are meant to address a particular set of skills. Students complete them, and then they move on to something else. Right. So the assignments themselves and the work that students do can seem a little bit choppy because you're moving from one thing to the next and not always establishing connections between those things, or the students aren't always establishing connections between those things. And as a result, as an instructor, you sometimes see the same mistakes. So if a student does something you tell them to address and the first part of the semester, the second part of the semester, you don't see them really addressing it all that much. So that's what I mean when I talk about the disjointed semester. I think there are reasons why we see this kind of approach in the classroom, why we might have, a set of discrete assignments, but it was bothering me that I hadn't intended that to be the effect of my teaching, and yet it kept appearing. The second thing, which is a little bit harder to describe, but I'm going to try, is the problem of what I'm calling the average paper. Now, I want to stress that an average paper is not in and of itself a problem. It is not a problem that a student does a decent job on an assignment. And by decent, I'm not referring to grades. I realize the illustration of the B on the paper makes it sound like I'm quantifying this. I'm not. But what I mean to suggest is not just a grade-based paper, right? A student has done a B level work. That's not what I'm after. But what I'm referring to with the average paper is what I would describe as a decent paper that shows real competency, even skill in some areas, but it gives the a sense that a student is most likely capable of more than what they've done, right? It's a paper that looks perfectly fine and yet doesn't really demonstrate the kind of mastery we would see at upper levels. And it also doesn't really demonstrate the kind of thought that I would often hear students presenting in classroom discussions or in other kinds of assignments, right? Why was I seeing this on essays and not in collaborative group presentations, right? Why wasn't I seeing this in certain contexts in the classroom, but I was in this case? This is an average paper would be one that fulfills its learning objectives in a pretty straightforward way, but doesn't yet excel in any of them. And I think as a result, and many instructors who assign a lot of writing probably know this, I think these are absolutely the hardest papers to comment on. If I have an A paper, I actually know a lot about what I would say. An exceptional paper, I know exactly what I could tell the student to do in terms of their future improvement. If I have a student who's failed an assignment, who is truly struggling, I have a lot that I can say there. But what do I do with a paper that seems to be doing a pretty decent job and yet is most likely capable of more? I can't simply ask the student to do more of what they've already done, right? Add more here. It's not about accumulation or accretion. It's really about challenging themselves to go beyond the kind of basic argument and framework that their paper proposes. But that's a big challenge. How do you describe that? And so the term better thinking from my subtitle really comes from a conversation that I had before I came to ISU. I was talking with a teaching mentor at the Harvard Writing Program, and I was describing the fact that this was early in my time there. I was describing the fact that I saw a lot of papers that I would describe in this way, the average paper. And she said, yes, like this is absolutely the hardest kind of paper to comment on because you can't tell a student to think better when that's sort of what every comment you want to say is indicating. Right? Like that's not a real bit of feedback you can give someone to think better. And yet what you're proposing they do kind of is a request to do that. So I noticed that I was seeing both of these problems in my classrooms and specifically in my upper level classes here at ISU. And so I thought about it and I thought about why are these versions of the same problem? What is the same source that these issues have? And unfortunately, the answer was me. I was the source of this, as so many issues in the classroom are. I was the source of the problem. And specifically, I realized it was my assignment design. It was what I was giving the students to do. So on the one hand, I wasn't really allowing enough opportunity for students to come back to what they had done at the beginning of the semester. So in terms of the disjointed semester, my assignments wanted that kind of engagement, but they didn't explicitly address it. And the way they were constructed did not specifically demand that students do that. It didn't ask them to refer back to what they had done before, even if it might have been implicitly, or the design of the assignments might have been implicitly founded on that request. It wasn't there. And then secondly, I wasn't designing writing assignments that really allowed students to produce the kind of work they were capable of. If I was seeing the kind of average paper as something that was specific to essay assignments, and I wasn't seeing it in other kinds of assignments, well, that sort of told me something, right? It indicated that the assignment itself, the essay assignments themselves, weren't doing the work that others were. Why was that? So in both cases, students weren't getting an opportunity to really meet the learning objectives I had for them because of how the assignments were pitched. I wanted them to challenge themselves. I wanted them to develop their thinking over key concepts over the course of a full semester, but I wasn't really creating assignments that facilitated that. So they weren't really able to put in practice and demonstrate what I'm calling better thinking, and as my teaching mentor at the time put it. So if better thinking wasn't really being facilitated here, how was I going to change that? Now, I should be concrete, a little more concrete about what I mean by better thinking when I use that term. I had to think about what better thinking would look like in these particular cases, in these courses with these assignments. So for me, better thinking was kind of twofold. First, I wanted students to engage with core concepts across an entire course, right? I wanted them to really work at specific ideas, practices, and concepts the entire semester long. I didn't want some things to be confined to one part of a semester or one part of a syllabus or another. I wanted them to be more continuous. So that was one goal I had. The second goal was I wanted students to challenge themselves to reassess those concepts regularly. Right? I wanted them to continue to develop their thinking about these ideas because I felt that that kind of continued engagement would not just get them in the habit of doing this, but it would also allow them to, as I mentioned here, challenge themselves and reassess. When they rethink what it is they're doing at the beginning, I found that their students' ideas can get much more specific, and they could start to push beyond those kinds of essays I was seeing early on. So if these were the two goals, then I kind of needed to think backward, all right? I needed to start with the goals and then work backward toward the assignments that would create them. So obviously, the third thing, I wanted students to demonstrate these two qualities. They had to do these things, but that didn't just mean class discussion, and it didn't mean the other assignments where I thought students were doing things reasonably well. It also had to come through other places. And I mentioned here in-class discussions, writing assignments, collaborative projects. In other words, this had to be the work of an entire class. It couldn't just be confined to one single thing. So regarding that last point, the assignments really had to do the work, right? The assignments had to create these conditions for students to act upon them. So that had to be how I provided the opportunity. So my solution was one that wasn't entirely unfamiliar to me. And it also was something that was, again, very specific because I didn't want to change every single thing about my teaching. You know, that would be a bit extreme. And I also didn't want to, I also wanted to provide some kind of change that I thought was measurable. Right, where I could see exactly how I was addressing these specific concerns in a specific way so that I could then look at the product, assess what students were doing, and see if that helped, right? If I changed everything all at once, that would be, in a sense, to get rid of some things that I knew already worked pretty well, and I didn't want to be disruptive to other parts of the course. So my solution was to design a set of sequential writing assignments. So I want to define that term too, because I think a lot of people do versions of this in different courses, and I want to be clear about what I'm suggesting. So sometimes when we talk about a sequential writing assignment or sequential writing assignments, we sometimes might refer to something like scaffolding, right? Where you have often shorter, low stakes assignments that students complete in order to build up skills necessary for higher stakes, often more challenging assignments. So if I want students to write an essay, for instance, based in close reading of a particular poem, I might give them a few short scaffolding assignments or response papers that allow them to close read smaller parts of different poems, practice their skills before they write a longer paper. If anybody's taught introductory writing or composition courses, this is going to sound very familiar. This is often what happens in introductory composition courses, but sort of weirdly, it doesn't happen as much in upper level courses. And I want to talk about why I think that is. So the scaffolding assignment would be the series of writing assignments where you're trying to help through these lower stakes assignments, you're trying to help students build up the skills for bigger projects. Here, I'm trying to refer to something a little bit more specific when I say sequential writing assignment. I mean, in a particular course that all or most writing assignments will focus on a single concept or idea that is then developed and refined over the entire term. Now, I said, I think this is pretty common in introductory composition courses. I think it's less so, and I didn't used to do it that much in upper level literature courses, which is primarily where I was teaching at the upper level, was in literature and literary studies. even though I knew that the method worked, even though that I knew this method was applicable in other contexts, I think in my own case, that was sort of out of habit, right? I knew that, my experience with upper level literature courses was one of term papers, exams, sometimes group projects, but they all were fairly distinct from one another. So the idea of pursuing a single question or a single idea over the course of the semester was less known to me as an option for those courses, even if ironically I had done it in others. So I think a lot of this was habitual on my part. So why do we write in sequence in the first place? Why did I think that this would be a useful strategy to address the two challenges I was finding, the disjointed semester and the average paper? Well, first, if you're writing in sequence in this way, you are demanding continuous engagement with core concepts. If you say that every assignment students are doing in a given semester is in some way going to focus on X or Y, then that concept is going to be pursued over the course of the next, how long are our semesters, like 30 weeks or something like that? That's how it feels, 30 weeks. So, I knew that this would be something that students would continuously have to engage in. I also knew that the material from the first week, so the material from week 1, would continue to be relevant in week 30, right? I knew that students would continue to see the relevance of material they had done at the outset of the term, and they would have to continue to use that in all subsequent assignments. So material that was studied early would still seem fresh and still seem relevant and applicable to what we were doing later. And then finally, I thought from the student's perspective, I do think there's some challenges with this that I'll address at the end, but I think that one of the benefits is that students can see their understanding of a concept or a subject deepen over time, right? If they're continually engaging with something and you're asking them to keep addressing the same question or come back to the same question or pose it a new way, students themselves notice what's happening, right? They can start to see by the end of the term how their thinking on a subject has either changed completely or has stayed remarkably the same, even as it's been tested over a series of prompts and anything in between. But either way, students see what they're doing as a particular use of their time that challenges them to understand a subject or concept in depth. And so I think, if you ask a student after the course is over, what were the central concepts of this course, they're likely to be able to furnish an answer to that question a little bit more quickly than they might in a course where the assignments are all very discrete or very distinct things. So those struck me as some of the primary benefits. So this is why I thought writing in sequence could be a useful idea to address these two problems. It's also worth asking why writing assignments. Why didn't I do other kinds of assignments? And I think it's not just because essays were really the place where I was seeing the most challenge, but I think, of course, other forms of student work could work perfectly well for this too. There might be other kinds of assignments that aren't essays, although I'll show you in a bit some of my prompts and you can see how I'm using the term essay here. It's not always uniform. I think that writing to me seemed like the most logical choice, not just because of this problem I was seeing in student essays, but also I'll share. I'm glad this is being recorded because I want to preserve for posterity some of the best teaching thinking I've ever seen. This is from, and I will always cite my sources here. So this is from a friend of mine named Paul Jowson, who teaches at Lawrence Technological University in Detroit. Paul and I once had a conversation about teaching, and he was saying that every time he's a literature professor as well, but he's a literature professor at an engineering school. And so he has to think quite a bit about this question. He said, I have to ask myself, if my class is the only class a student will ever take in this discipline or field, what do they absolutely need to come away with? Right? What is it that they need to know if this is their only exposure to a poetry class or a film class? Right? What do they need from that? So in my field, and I bet in many of yours too, one of the things they need to know how to do is to write. They need to know how to write effectively. They need to know how to express complex ideas clearly and with accuracy. And they need to make connections across wide swaths of material, right? Like they need to be able to connect seemingly dissimilar things or point to the nuances between seemingly similar things. All of these are things that come through writing, whether they're writing a kind of quote unquote traditional essay, whether they're writing a speech or a presentation, a grant proposal. Any kind of genre of writing really allows them to practice those things. And so obviously the content of a course is going to be relevant, right? Like I teach, modernist novels because I think those are valuable in their own right. But when I approach my courses with this question, I'm oftentimes kind of thinking about content, but always in relationship to something else. Content takes on a little bit less importance. And I have a quote here from a really recent book by another English professor, Pat Collier, who wrote a book for Bloomsbury called Teaching Literature in the Real World, kind of a fun title. And he says this at the outset of that book, and what he means by his own approach to literature and how his teaching philosophy has changed. He describes in the opening chapter of this book kind of a disastrous multi-day attempt to teach one specific poem and how it just kept getting worse and worse. And part of it was because he was focusing on the poem and not how he was teaching it. Right. And so this is what he says. He says, to use broad layman's terms, I and many other literature professors have come to think that what students can do is more important than what they know. I and much of the profession have moved from an emphasis on content knowledge to an emphasis on method. Now, he goes on to say, of course, it's not that content is irrelevant, right? He teaches literature for a reason and not other subjects. And he teaches specific works of literature for specific reasons and not other subjects. But his idea of teaching is now much more founded on the idea of method. What does he want students to do? And I think this is how I've been approaching teaching in my own classes as well. I don't necessarily need students, and particularly undergraduate students, although this applies to graduate students too. I'm not really looking for them to become experts in a given field of study. It's not as if they automatically need to read a poem or interpret any other work in the same way that I would. I'm not trying to replicate myself or think that everyone is going to be a kind of proto-academic. But I want students to do a few things. I mean, I want them to be able to approach course material critically. I want them to analyze it thoroughly and generously. And I want them to express their ideas clearly. So writing it is. Writing is my way to emphasize method in these particular settings. So let me go through some examples. Apologies, these got a little busy. So I'll try and kind of go over some of the main parts of this slide. So I'm going to present sort of two examples and what each one kind of hinges on. What's the core concept that I wanted to address? So the first one is a course that I teach somewhat regularly in the English department. It's English 6612. This is Introduction to Graduate Studies. I see a couple people attending today who have done this, who have been in this class with me. So I really want to hear what you thought too. I know in some ways, but I think that's a useful part of this discussion. When I was teaching Introduction to Graduate Studies, part of what that course is really doing, and let me explain the context for those who might teach similar courses in other departments. So this is a required course for new MA students in English. It's also taken by new PhD students who did not have a similar course at another graduate institution. As I was kind of thinking about how I wanted to teach the course this most recent time, it occurred to me that really what the course is asking is, with everything it's asking, is with the goal of professional development, right? Helping students to find their bearings within the academic study of literature and culture, getting them acclimated to this setting, getting them acclimated to perhaps new reading and research methods that are going to be expected, and with which they may have some familiarity, but perhaps not facility yet. And then helping them to find their own specific interests, right? What do they want to do for this program? How is this program going to work with their professional needs and goals? So, and this is important because many of our students, particularly at the MA level, apply as generalists, right? They have kind of broad interests, but of course they have to write a thesis on something, on a specific topic. They're going to take specific courses, and they want to start to think about what their place is within the discourse that they're encountering. So what we do is we start out with a few weeks on critical methods, kind of talking about some of the most prominent approaches to literary and cultural works in English studies. Then we'll spend a little bit of time applying those skills to specific contexts. So we'll read a few critical articles, we'll read a monograph, and kind of talk about how we can approach those works with the kind of critical perspectives we've gained. Then we have a few writing assignments. And this is what I decided to do. There are other assignments that came earlier to kind of facilitate what I was talking about. But when we got to the major goals, this is what I had asked them to do. I had them write a sequence of, I call them either reports or profiles. So for the first one, this was an article report. They had to select an academic article published recently or relatively recently in a peer-reviewed journal that reflected one of their academic interests. So this was a pretty broad question, but I wanted them to essentially summarize not just the argument of a piece in their field, but I want them to talk about kind of the critical moves that it makes. What sort of sources is it drawing on, and how? How does this work use evidence? How does it also display a certain kind of trend or participate in a kind of critical trend that we see right now? So essentially practicing what we had done before as a group with something much more specific to student interests. Then from there, we did what's called a field report, where I wanted them to move from that specific article to a broader field in which it participates. So the students then have to write a short essay describing the field of study that they wanted to participate in their degree program. So if a student was interested in medieval studies, tell me what the field of medieval studies looks like right now. What are its major journals? What are its major conferences? What are some of the most recent book series in that field? What kinds of arguments do you see being made? Who do you see cited regularly, and why do you think that is? So again, giving them kind of a broad understanding of a field. And then finally, the course culminated with a short essay where they had to kind of position themselves much more directly in this field. What do they want to study in this particular graduate program? What faculty members do they want to work with, and why? What kinds of projects can they envision for future works? What journals most interest them? So for instance, if a field has, 7 really prominent journals, which one of them speaks to you the most, and why is that? What is its critical perspective that draws you to it? So these assignments were all designed to build a student's understanding of a given field slowly over time, so that they kept coming back to the same question. So by the end of the course, the idea is that they will have a greater understanding, not just of a few different fields in academia, in the academic study of English, but they might also understand their own place in that conversation more directly. Now, this was a graduate course, so I also have another example. This is for a course I'm teaching right now, and I also see some of the students in that class here. So this is where you get the advanced look, although you know all this already, because of course it's in the syllabus. But so this course I'm teaching right now, this is for our general course in early 20th century literature. This can be taught a number of different ways, but I decided to focus it on a critical term with a disputed definition. So the term is modernism. This, not coincidentally, is my own area of study. And of course, I picked the thing to study that doesn't have a settled definition at all. There's so many different critical approaches to modernism. The most prominent one right now, for those who are interested, is that modernism is an aesthetic response to modernity. And if you're asking yourself, what the hell does that mean? That's not an uncommon response to someone approaching this for the first time. So I wanted to teach a course that was really based on this animating question: what is modernism? If that definition is disputed, I wanted students to come away from this course having some idea of what it might be for them, and with a critically informed idea, right? So I decided to do an entire assignment sequence surrounding the question, what is modernism? So the course is divided into 3 units. The first unit starts with what I'm calling kind of canonical or traditional modernism. I dislike that framework, but you'll see why. So we start the semester reading James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. I say I don't like it because Woolf has been kind of variously in and out of modernist studies for various reasons. But I wanted students in this first essay to just answer the question, what is modernism, by showing how one of these 2 novels really exemplifies some of the key tenets of modernist fiction, right? So we have a set of ideas or practices or principles that are commonly associated with modernism, particularly these works. Pick one and explain how it shows us what modernism is. That's the unit 1 our assignment. For the second unit, we're looking at what I'm calling non-canonical modernism. These are texts that are increasingly understood in terms of modernism and modernist studies, but for various reasons have not been or have been challenged for a long time. So works by Jean Toomer, Claude McKay, Jean Rees, people who have become incorporated into modernist studies much more frequently, but haven't always been. So what this next, I'm calling this a response because it's really a response to the initial essay. What I'm asking students to do here is reevaluate their answer to the previous question by analyzing one of the texts from the non-canonical modernism unit. How does that work compare? Does it do the same things or not? Do you have to broaden your understanding of modernism or change it in some way? Or is this work fundamentally in keeping with what you've already suggested? And then finally, their last assignment, I'm calling the reflection essay, and that's corresponding to the last unit of our course. And these are works of popular modernism. So comic strips, popular novels like Anita Luce's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, or detective novel by Dorothy Sayers. These are works that are, really produced at the height of the modernist period, and many would still say are works of modernism, but they challenge the definition much more intensely. So here I want students to explain how one of these examples of popular modernism does or doesn't fall into the category of modernism as they now understand it, right? And the emphasis here is on how they now understand it. So each assignment addresses the same question, but from a different angle. So here what I've done is to try and get students to think about this question continuously and putting every text we encounter throughout the semester within the same conversation. Now, I think there are some potential challenges of this approach. There are some potential pitfalls. So obviously, if you're doing this, it means students can't engage with all content equally, right? I'm giving them lots of choices in how they approach a specific question. So it means that we can't cover everything with the same amount of energy or attention. Now, I would argue that that's kind of the case anyway, that most courses that's unavoidable. But when this question comes up, what I often emphasize is the fact that students are going to be able to follow their own interests all term. Like I'm giving them the animating questions, but they're really deciding how they want to pursue things, right? So this is very much a tailored experience for them. Now, another pitfall might be, well, students might get tired of doing the same kind of thing all semester, the same assignment. Here, and I hope I've shown that, especially in the what is modernism question, but in the other one too, I try and give assignments that have slight variations that allow for different forms of engagement. I specifically want them to do things slightly differently, even if that just means reevaluate what you did the first time. You might come to a similar conclusion. That's okay. Just follow the process of thinking it through again from this slightly different perspective or with this different knowledge that you've gained. The other potential problem is that students' improvement may be limited, right? Like what if by the end of a semester, a student is still struggling with this concept? What if students expected more improvement or more change in their thinking, better thinking, but they don't quite see it? I think there are two strategies for this. One is simply to refine the prompts, right? That might mean that the prompts themselves need more or need to be a little bit different. But secondly, and I do this in my teaching, I'm sure all of you do as well, but I try to emphasize small but significant steps, right? Just the act of approaching something differently or returning to something complex and trying again and again, that's a significant thing to do. It builds practice for later courses. And I think it makes students more attentive to key concepts in other courses and other contexts. So emphasizing those small things, I think, helps a lot. Now, as I've done this, what have I seen? I had to throw in a picture of Chidi Aragonye from The Good Place for this. Obviously, I like to write. I always wish that the result is that all students love to write. That's not, as I think we've all learned, that's not always the lesson that's taken away here. But what I do see is that I see students regularly reference early material by the end of the semester. Right? I see them doing what they weren't for, returning to and recalling specific important things and applying them to later assignments. I'm seeing students are willing to consider and refine their positions more often. Sometimes I think students will begin a semester, particularly if it's something they have a little bit of an idea about, with kind of a notion of, okay, this is what it is, right? I kind of understand this now. And those kinds of assumptions get unsettled over the course of the semester by returning to them and refining them. So I see students, even if their positions on a given topic or their interpretation of something doesn't change in huge ways, they at least have a better understanding of why they think what they think. And they've had a lot more experience in kind of coming to conclusions about why that is. And then finally, I think they demonstrate a more nuanced understanding of key concepts. They understand, in the case of modernism, it's quite obvious that the term is a fluid one, and they understand where that fluidity comes from and how they might start to narrow it down a bit or make it more concrete for themselves. They can do that with a lot more nuance without kind of, without kind of giving something that's overly general. So those are the results I see, all of which seem to me to have been good, positive things that tells me that what this new kind of writing in sequence approach does is working pretty well. So that's what I have. I mean, I know we have time. I of course want to leave time for questions. I have a few things that I just wanted to put out there. I don't want to direct the conversation in any particular way, but just to give you some ideas of what I'm thinking. I'd love to hear ideas about how this might transfer to other disciplines. I mean, I've thought about this a bit, but I'm curious about how other disciplines, maybe even those disciplines that don't typically assign a lot of writing, might take this sort of sequential approach and apply it. I'm curious if people do something like this already, and if so, how they do that. And then other strategies for achieving similar effects, right? How can we address the problem of the disjointed semester or the problem of the average essay through other means? Because as I said before, I think there are other ways to do that. Okay, I'm going to stop my share here as much as I'd like to linger on Ted Lasso. Okay, all right. So yeah, so that's what I have. I'd love to open it up for questions, comments regarding some of those points I made, or really anything else related to this.
So I don't want to take over, Matt, but I do have a question as you were talking. So I'll get us started off. I was thinking about, I've tried to do variations on this, but not fully successfully in my classes. And so I loved the examples. But I'm wondering if you're focusing on a specific key concept or key theme, do you find with some classes that results in certain other really important concepts being sort of pushed aside or not addressed as fully as maybe they should be, or vice versa? If you try to focus on a couple, 2 or 3 major concepts, does it end up sort of spreading too thin for students, so they struggle to get to that point? Because I think that's one of the things I've struggled with is, trying to hit a few key things and then they just can't kind of keep up with it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, so I hear you asking a little bit about, in what ways does this approach lead to either too divided an attention or too narrow an attention, depending on context. I think some of it pretty obviously depends on the class itself. So there are certain courses where I think I'm not so concerned about the narrow focus. So for instance, I know this is kind of a common practice among some people, some colleagues I have at other institutions, where they'll often, they'll devote an entire class, an entire semester long class to one book. So this semester, we're just going to read Moby Dick. Right. I did this as an undergrad in a course on James Joyce. We specifically read the novel Ulysses. The first half of the semester, you read Ulysses. The second half of the semester, you reread Ulysses. Now that instructor absolutely knew what he was doing. That was such a great experience. But it meant that, this course, which was ostensibly to focus on, 20th century Irish literature, was going to have a very particular theme, right? We were not going to get at so many other areas of 20th century Irish literature. And yet, if you've read Ulysses, you know that novel can lead you into a lot of those things otherwise, right? And so part of, I think, what works about that particular kind of approach is you sort of accept that the structure of a given catalog description. I mean, if we look at our catalog descriptions, we can see a huge amount of variety. We can see some courses where you have to cover multiple things, some courses where they're very open. 20th century Irish literature could mean a lot of things, even within that sort of literary historical category. And if the focus is on method, then, well, how do you match the course itself to those methodological goals without sacrificing too much? I think for certain kinds of courses, like 20th century Irish literature, this works pretty well. There are other kinds of courses where I think, the questions have to change, even if the method doesn't. So if I'm teaching a course, sort of an early course in literary criticism and theory, I want the students to be conversant with multiple theoretical approaches, right? Now, some are going to get left out because of the time we have, but I'm going to try and pick the ones that I think are most fundamental. And we'll talk about critical genealogies, and I'll develop assignments that ask students specifically, okay, now that you've learned like these two approaches, how would you apply them to this text? And then we'll return to the same text a few weeks later with different methodological approaches and ask the same kind of question, right? So the idea is that even if a student is covering a lot of different material, that attention isn't divided because it's always on that question of interpretation, right? How do you think through this material? How do you use it to ask questions of the same literary text? And so by the end, students can see the variety of approaches. So I think that's my idea for, I think the idea of scattered or divided attention is usually covered by this pretty well, because this approach kind of focuses you in, students in on method. In terms of a narrow approach, one thing that I've done is simply to have students, in class, like spend a day where students kind of present their ideas for some of these different questions or these different assignments. So for the graduate course, for instance, let's have everybody go around and say a little bit about what the field they chose is, and how would you characterize the state of that field. And that way, even a student the student who studied medieval literature, right, now knows something about, contemporary approaches in rhetoric and composition, right, and vice versa. So even when one student might be choosing their own adventure in a very specific direction, they still are exposed to these other perspectives. So I think that kind of sharing opens things up a little bit more too. I hope it does.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask too, I'm curious if anybody does something like this already. And if so, like how's it going, or how did it go?
So, hi, I'm Liz.
Hey.
I'm in anthropology and American Indian Studies. And I actually do, but I didn't really realize that I was doing this. So I've moved away from formal essays to shorter writing assignments. So those will be, like small reading responses each week. And I ask students to make a personal connection at the end of their reading responses. And it's just a series of, short, like maybe they have to do maybe 2 paragraphs, and then 1 sentence each that summarizes the main point or main argument of the article that they were reading, across 3 different readings. And then a synthesis paragraph, and then a connection paragraph. But about 3 times a semester, I have students do a reflection activity. And in that reflection activity, in addition to having them reflect on their learning, I ask them to reflect on how what they have learned about or engaged with this unit connects to the overall course theme. And so we revisit that question over and over again. The overall course theme for, say, sociolinguistics is how language relates to power.
Mhm.
And so I just keep bringing them back to, okay, how does language relate to power? And so, of course, their thinking is going to change. Well, hopefully their thinking is going to change or become more nuanced over the course of the semester.
Yeah, well, and I think that really, I like that a lot. And I think that really also speaks to something I didn't really touch on, but I think is important, like having a course theme in general, right? I mean, even within like, the catalog definitions of our courses, like we still have usually sort of central concepts that kind of connect everything, right? I mean, I find this hard in surveys, for instance, like introductory literature surveys. I mean, how do you connect, British literature from 1800 to now, to use a very specific problem I face? How do you connect every reading in that way, or can you? But I think the importance of the course theme really helps, because in a way that also is kind of a statement of what you value. I think of a lot of teaching as just making clear what it is you value pedagogically, right? So if you value argumentative writing, for instance, which is something I value, then I have to make sure my assignments ask for that, right? And help students do that. If I value certain kinds of an approach to research, or say just knowledge of how to conduct research in literary studies, then I need to make sure that assignments specify that and ask students to practice those things. And in the same way, the course theme is really kind of a statement of what that course values, what you want students to learn. And interestingly, I mean, that's usually content-based, right? But the way you approach it, I think, often emphasizes method. So this is kind of a way where the content doesn't get dropped out either, even in courses where content knowledge is really key. I mean, and yet I think the kind of emphasis on application really brings these things together. Before I came to ISU, I worked a little bit for the Harvard Writing Project, and one of the things I did for that was to work with faculty in disciplines that didn't often include a lot of writing assignments, particularly at the gen ed level. So I worked a lot with the School of Public Health and other places, trying to think and help instructors come up with writing assignments that really put into practice the things that they valued. So there were a lot of like policy briefs and research memos and things like that, where these fields, the introductory gen ed courses often seem to be to new students about content. No student in high school has ever taken a course in public health, at least not. And so introducing them to that field takes a lot of work at the intro level. But really, you're not just teaching them content, you're also teaching them like what is a memo, right? How is that different from other kinds of writing you've done? Who is its intended audience? What is the audience of public health? Those kinds of things allow you to kind of continually take a course theme, but have students speak to it in these different kinds of genres, in these connected writing assignments. This is another place I emphasize sequential writing, to get students familiar with different genres that all spoke to the same question, right? I just see a note in the chat here as well, from Ajit Bhattari, about asking students to build a dictionary. I really love that. Would you mind saying a little bit about that approach? I like that a lot.
Yeah, sure. And this particular assignment really has resonated with me because of my own difficulties, especially reading philosophies when I was in grad school.
Mm-hmm.
I come from a banking background, so I didn't have any idea about any philosophies. So reading critical theory, both structuralist and the modernist. So So one of the professors highly encouraged us to, because she was encountering students like me all the time. So she just asked us to pick out words every week from the readings. And then the first prompt would be to kind of write a note to yourself what you understand this particular word at this particular moment, and then use the readings as well as go outside of the readings and try to explore what this particular phrase or word has been used differently, right? So that would be on a weekly basis, and then at periodic intervals, I now do that in my own classes also. Then I go back to the students and ask them to revisit those same ideas, and then have another line under those 3 or 4 different paragraphs or lines, how much they write, to note their evolving understanding of how they're understanding that particular phrase, right? But it will not be in, then these assignments are not independent each other. So they'll be tied up with a larger project right at the end, where they will need to reflect of these revolving understanding and how they've understood that course as a whole. So it's kind of those building blocks, small pieces, and it gives the space for the students to work on their own where they're struggling. And obviously, as a faculty, I'm always there to help them, guide them, but it's their own unique difficulties in understanding that particular phrase, and then tying it up with a larger study, a larger body of work that we're reading in that class. So it's a kind of a scaffolding process. So I personally, I and a bunch of other grad students in my doctoral program, we really loved it, and my students have also loved it. So I think that's very similar, not exactly like what you, but it's kind of that scaffolding process. And then so the students will not remember everything, but they'll have a piece of paper that they can take away from that class, and then have something to reflect, and then possibly get some recall some ideas or thoughts from that particular course over a period of a few years also.
Yeah, I love that approach too. I actually, before I taught my modernism class that I mentioned earlier in this particular way, centered around the question of what is modernism, I centered it around keywords. And so every class session, we would start with a specific keyword related to the reading we did that day. And then at the end of the semester, we were all supposed to tally these up. And the last day, we look at every single keyword that we produced and think about what do these things have in common? Where do we see departures, and where did that happen in the course of the semester? So you can start to kind of make connections across a broad swath of material. The other thing I like about the dictionary assignment you mentioned is just, I mean, that emphasis on you, right? Like how you, the student, interpret this thing. Where do you have questions? Where do you, or what kind of definition would you furnish of this particular word or concept? I mean, and I hope that's clear in the assignments I share, the prompts I share too. Of course, these prompts are much longer, as my students here know. This is the 2-line version, but you know, the fact that in all of them, the emphasis on what you, the student, know. What do you think? Because that is genuinely what I want to know. I mean, I think, and especially this is important at the upper level. And this is maybe another reason why I focused on upper level courses here, because I think at the upper level, there's often an assumption students have, like, okay, like I'm a senior now, like I should know this, right? Or I'm in graduate school now, like I'm supposed to know this. Well, why? You know, like there are plenty of times where my course is going to be the first one where people encounter certain kinds of material or certain kinds of questions, right? And so even as, 1,000 and 2,000 level courses might prepare you for this in some ways, some of this material is going to be brand new. And so I think making sure students know that, like, reflection is good, questioning is good, and a thing you want to do, don't feel as if you have to have an immediately settled, entirely correct definition of something, right? Like, it's okay to work on these concepts over time, because that's what some people devote their whole careers to. So I think that kind of focus on reflection and reiteration is also important, because it personalizes this process. Like, when students feel like the assignments they're completing are meaningful to them and the questions they have, we know that engagement is much better, and we know that students come out feeling as if they've produced something that they're personally invested in, and I always hope proud of.
Well, Matt, I hate to interrupt the conversation, but we are at end of time, and I want to respect people's schedules. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining us today. I took lots of notes, even though I know it's all going to be on the recording. Writing ideas down for my own classes, so thank you for that. I also, again, just want to remind people that October 11th is the next PI event. And I might, if Liz is willing, just mention that that's also Indigenous Peoples Day. And Liz, you said there are going to be some events. Do you have any information right now, or should they just check back and keep eyes open?
Oh, certainly. So a save the date's gone around. The agenda should be coming around soon. But there will be a sunrise ceremony at 7:30, a keynote address at about 9, performances and Indian tacos on the quad again, workshops in the afternoon that only barely overlap with the PIE workshop. And one of those I'm actually leading, and its title is Decolonize Your Syllabus, how to set the tone for a more inclusive class. And then in the evening, we are really excited. We're going to have a live musical performance by Superman, who is an absolute hip hop comedy artist.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for coming. We appreciate your time and attention today. Have a good one.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.